Hello everyone. This is the part 2 of the presentation on the topic of is international trade always good for the economy? In this topic, we shall discuss who benefits from the globalization the most. Here, we shall see what happens when international trade reaches a matured stage of its progress. While I understand that globalization is a much bigger concept than international trade, but international trade unquestionably is one of the most critical aspects of globalization because international trade impacts the economy and the economy affects the day-to-day lives of public, and hence the policies of the government based upon the impact of international trade on the day-to-day life of the public, and this ultimately has a bearing on globalization. We shall also see the benefits of international trade to developing countries, how it can help the economy overall or disturb the economies overall in our continuing presentation on open economy macroeconomics basic concepts part 2. So a quick recap. We saw that when international trade starts between countries with stark productivity differences, international trade is usually good for both the countries and overall for almost all the participants in the economy. So as now the international trade progresses further, the exchange rate of the importing country, which is the US, would should have started declining, and the exchange rate of the exporting country, that is China, would have started increasing. Also, we would see that since the US is importing goods and services and China is exporting goods and services, so supply of goods and services in US would increase relative to the money supply in the United States. Thus, the inflation levels in United States should have declined. And while China is exporting goods and services and importing money, the overall money supply in China would increase compared to the goods and services produced in China, and hence inflation should have gone higher. And even that should have reflected in the exchange rate. Now, so what would have happened? Well, China now, as the international trade matures, should, apart from supplying goods and services to US, now should also be sending in inflation back to US. In a normal scenario then, because of this, as the inflation of imported inflation would have risen in the US, the overall demand for those goods and services in US would have declined. And as the demand would have declined, so would have the imports. That would have meant that the exchange rate would have then readjusted itself, thereby increasing the dollar price vis-a-vis the price of Chinese yuan and shifting some of the supply back to the US. That would have happened in a free exchange rate regime. However, in reality, this adjustment process is not allowed to take place. Since the yuan has been kept in a fixed or relatively tight range, what happens is the inflation levels in US is steady, while that in China rises even further. So this policy of keeping the exchange rate relatively fixed by China has a big side effect, which is the loss of efficacy of the US fiscal and monetary policy. Let's see how. So, the United States government, let's say, increases its fiscal deficit, or in other words, takes in more debt. Now let's also say that that debt is monetized by the central bank. So increase in the money supply, thus both combined leading to an increase in the domestic US demand. Now in a relatively closed setup or in a setup where the exchange rate would have been allowed to float, that would have meant that the supply in US would have increased, thus raising the growth in the domestic economy of US. However, since most of the supply has been now outsourced to China, because of increase in fiscal and monetary policy, the supply in US remains almost steady. That means the growth in US doesn't respond to the fiscal and monetary policy of US by a great extent. Let's continue further. So that means the imports, that increased demand is being satisfied by the increase in imports into US. Now since the exchange rate is kept steady by China, that would translate into inflation, domestic inflation in the US, or the imported inflation in the US being steady again. And hence the demand will not fall at all, even in spite of increase in imports, while on the other, or as time progresses, it will keep on rising because of the fiscal and monetary stimulus provided by the US. And so, in spite of the monetary and fiscal stimulus provided by the US, since the domestic supply of the US is not responding much, the growth in US economy doesn't increase by much. On the other hand, where the effect happens, it happens in China, as the Chinese growth would increase because of the fiscal and monetary stimulus in United States. So, as the international trade progresses in the setup of almost kind of a fixed exchange rate, what's happening? What's the impact on players across geographies? In US, the financialization still carries on profitably. Though some companies' profitability starts to decline, but overall it's good for financial institutions and banks. Outsourcing companies in US, because the exchange rate is fixed, the profitability of these companies is good. Though some profitability hit happens because of increase in inflation in the domestic markets of China. Exporting companies in the US, which used to export goods in China, are not doing so great as before. Still okay, but not so great. Reason? There is a decline in the demand for imported goods because of the rise in inflation in China. And the exchange rate is not also favorable for the Chinese people. The workers who are working in the exporting companies, hence in the United States, are not doing so well as the demand is not so great anymore. And some also start to lose their jobs. While the workers who are working in the importing companies, the outsourcing companies in the United States, are still doing fine. The product prices are still low and they have their jobs, so they are still doing okay. And so overall, the workers in the United States are not doing as great as before, as the status of workers who were working earlier in the exporting companies has declined. There are workers who are, more workers are out of job, and so the overall status of workers in United States has declined compared to what it was when the international trade had started. Now, how are the players in China doing? The financial institutions, great again. Now, exporting companies from China are also doing well, though again their profitability has declined because of the increase in wages and in domestic inflation. The companies who cater to the domestic demand in China and the companies who are importing goods from US, their companies are not doing good at all because of the higher inflation in China. The workers who are working in the exporting companies in China are not that better off as before because of the rise in domestic inflation, but still okay. Workers who are working in the companies that used to import goods into China are seeing tougher times now. And finally, the workers who are creating to a domestic demand in China again are seeing tougher times because of the lower demand, domestic demand in China on account of higher inflation. And some would even start losing their jobs. So in conclusion of this part 2, international trade now is no longer a positive sum game. Although things are much better than what they were when the international trade actually had started or began, but they have started to deteriorate as well. The financial institutions are still gaining, but there are some set of companies that are gaining, while on the other hand, there are some set of companies that have started to lose as well. Similarly, some set of workers are still okay, while some have started to lose in this international trade game. The gains are now increasingly getting concentrated on higher levels, that is, bigger financial institutions, bigger companies involved in specific kind of businesses, and more or less at the government level as well. Overall, the exporting country does slightly better than the importing country on a cumulative basis, as the fiscal and monetary policy of the importing country starts to lose their efficacy, especially in the fixed exchange rate scenario. Now, what happens to globalization as a result of this? As the benefits of international trade become scantier and increasingly skewed towards bigger players like the financial institutions, certain set of companies, and even some governments, the advantages that globalization gave becomes murky, and hence a backlash grows towards it. Now, beneficiaries, though people who benefited from globalization or are benefiting, try to advocate globalization and force it using their influence that they have gained over the years in the overall power setup of the world, when instead they should have taken a step back, and this makes the backlash even stronger and more against it. And so, like everything in this world, almost everything in this world, which is cyclical, globalization is also cyclical. Even though I believe its secular trend is higher, but in between, it follows the cyclical path. And currently, we are in the waning part of that cycle. In this part, nationalism gains currency, and the global elites who are occupying places of influence, maybe due to some of their good work or the good work of their progenies who gain influence, and because of their influence and nepotism they might be sitting over there, starts to lose their influence and position as they advocate increasingly and force the issue of globalization down the throat of masses, which is at this point of time greatly abhorred. Which was great at one point in time, but globalization today is greatly abhorred, thus making them lose their position and influence. And hence, overall, globalization starts to lose out, and not just lose out, a backlash starts to getting formed against globalization. So thank you very much for watching this presentation. Do subscribe if you like such content, and comment in case of any questions. And after this, do check the part 3 of this presentation to see how finally it all ends in this international trade scenario. Thanks a lot.